Good evening all, and welcome. Today I present you with an extra long compilation of some truly terrifying stories. I hope you have your flashlights ready, as it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. It's worth mentioning that whilst this story takes place in a Southeast Asian city with a population of over 1.5 million, I didn't always live here. I was born and raised in a small town in the Midwestern United States. You know, the kind where everyone knows everyone, and we only gain attention during an election year. Anyway, my parents and I made the big move in 2014 due to a number of reasons. The biggest being so that my mother could be with her family, since this was her homeland. However, the town where all my relatives live is about 8 hours away. So we had to move to our city because it was the safest in the region for foreigners, and my dad is a white guy. Now, unlike every other college student in the world, I hadn't done much this summer. The heat was blistering all hours of the day, and I didn't have money to spend even if I was willing to leave our air-conditioned apartment. The only thing enticing me into the outdoors were the incessant sounds of construction due to a new unit being added to our complex. However, leaving was of course inevitable, so towards the end of the month, my parents and I went to buy groceries. The next day, my mum and I went out to buy some things that we had initially forgotten. And the day after that, the two of us went out again to pay some bills. That made 3 consecutive days of going out for the first time in about a month. To say I was exhausted was an understatement, and by 7 PM on the third night, I was already fast asleep on the living room couch. My mother woke me up at around 10 that night and told me to head up to my room. I was too tired to do my entire night's routines, so I quickly brushed my teeth and went upstairs. I noticed that my cat was already asleep in my bed, since he's basically my mother's shadow. So I got into bed whilst contorting myself into an angle that wouldn't disturb him. Cat lovers, you know what I'm talking about. I turned on a dim light, plugged in my headphones, and started playing a random video on YouTube, then eventually fell asleep. I didn't know what time it was, but I awoke to the feeling of my bed shaking. I tend to ignore movements like this, because they happen often when my cat sleeps with me, as he has a habit of scratching his ear. But there was a pretty strong earthquake just the night before, so I assumed it was another one, making me open my eyes and look down at my cat to see which of the two it was. Indeed, it was he scratching his ear, and my mother was also at the foot of my bed. Nothing out of the ordinary. She was probably checking on me before my dad and her went out on their 5 AM walk, as routine, and was bending down to pet the cat. I closed my eyes and was just about to slip back into slumber when my half-asleep brain remembered a number of things that were indeed out of the ordinary. With my eyes that were barely open, I looked at who I thought was my mother with blurred vision. The first thing I noticed was that she was wearing one of my high school t-shirts. My mother and I are far from the same size, and she doesn't have a history of borrowing my clothes. Weird, but not unsettling. Maybe she ran out of clean exercise shirts and decided to use one of mine. Then I notice that she was also wearing one of my high school t-shirts, but this one was wrapped around her head in a way that outlined the shape of it, not covering anything, but just framing the profile. In my peripheral vision, I noticed that my closet doors were wide open. My mother always nagged me to close them, because she said it wasted the cool air coming in from the air conditioner, so I made sure to keep them closed whenever I wasn't getting ready. And another random realization hit me, when my brain finally registered the fact that while my mum does pet my cat when she comes in to check on me, she never bent down like the person was in my room. Looking back now, I don't think I've ever seen her bend down like that since I was a kid. Keep in mind, all these thoughts flooded my mind in about 5 seconds. Still, my half asleep and half stupid ass brain was more focused on why my mother was wearing my clothes as opposed to all the things that were off in this situation. That's when the person turned to look right at me before running out of my room, maintaining an ungodly crouching position that will be buried in my mind for the rest of my life. It wasn't until he was near the stairs that I fully processed what was happening. That person was not my mother, and they weren't even a female. Instantly I shot out of bed and instinctively wrapped my blanket around me to cover my nightclothes that suddenly felt so revealing. It was only then that I began screaming. I hesitantly followed him out of my room and watched as he ran down the wooden stairs with deafening steps that echoed throughout the 3rd floor, almost drowning out my piercing cry. If I was going to get my parents' attention, who was sleeping on the other side of the closed door on the 2nd floor, I needed to be louder. I stood at the foot of the stairs and pushed my lungs to their limit. I could practically feel the capacity stretch inside my rib cage, and after what felt like ages, but was probably no more than 5 seconds, my parents' door swung open, and my mother ran up the stairs with a panic-stricken expression that I will never forget. She grabbed me by the shoulders and shouted, What's wrong?" I turned to look at her, my mouth agape, and my brows furrowed in a mixture of confusion and disbelief. Had she not seen the man when he ran right past their bedroom? It all happened so fast. I wasn't sure if they had crossed paths or not. I told them that someone was in the house, and I responded in a voice that honestly I didn't even recognize. Without missing a beat, she wrapped her arm around me and ushered me down the stairs. "Grab the gun," she shouted in the country's native language, and we ran into my parents' bedroom, where my father stood in the doorway, with tired eyes and slumped posture. I pushed him in the room and turned around to close the door, simultaneously fiddling with the light switch so we weren't in complete darkness. My movements were shaky and spastic, causing my fingers to fumble and flicker the lights on and off before eventually being able to lock the door. "What are you doing?" my dad asked with a soft laugh, as he switched on the lights after my attempts proved to be futile. I turned to him with the same incredulous expression I had when I was looking at my mum. He had been standing in the doorway to his room in perfect view of the running man, yet he seemed to be oblivious. "There's someone in the house," I repeated, watching his face instantly drop at my words. With the door now locked, I turned to my parents and watched them silently, waiting for them to say or do something. For 19 years they had taken care of me and catered to my every want and need. Now they stood, just as scared and defenseless as I was, and in that moment, they were just people. My dad, an infamous type A personality, kept his focus on the floor, most likely processing the entire situation before deciding what to do next. My mother was the complete opposite. Her cell phone was in one hand, whilst the other, she was trying to run through her hair so many times that I'm sure the strands were going to end up between her fingers. "I can't call 911, it's not working," she said. I took the phone from her and dialed it myself, bringing the phone up to my ear, only to hear a monotone voice say, "Sorry, your balance is too low to make this call." In this country, most of the phones are prepaid, so if you don't have money in your account, you can't make any calls or texts. However, my mum said that she had added to her account a few hours earlier. I tried calling my aunt, who lives about 8 hours away, and it worked. And it was then that I figured that you can only use cell phones to call other cell phones, and you can't use them to call landlines, aka 911. The only problem was that our landline was on the second floor hallway, a few feet away from the other side of the door. I told my parents what our options were, and my mother opened the window and began shouting for help in her native tongue. Similar to a knee-jerk reaction, I instantly shut the window. "Don't do that, they'll know we're defenseless and come back." At the time this happened, we had been in the room for about 40 minutes, and I was convinced that if they had left and then heard screaming, they would come back because they would know we were sitting ducks. "Are you sure you saw someone? Maybe you were just dreaming," my dad said, this being his first string of words since barricading ourselves inside. How could he have gotten in? The door has 2 locks and a heavy pole across it. A little context about the pole. After the lock on our screen door broke, my mother had insisted on putting a metal pole across the door to ensure that no one would be able to get in. "No, I know what I saw," I answered without hesitation. But my brain started dissecting the possibilities of the figure simply being a fragment of my imagination. The sounds of movement he made were so vivid, but the situation as a whole seemed too surreal. There was no way someone can get inside with that pole acting as a shield, and neither of my parents had seen the man. Internally, even I wasn't 100% sure of myself, but on the outside, I stuck to my guns. I saw a man. "Okay, then we need to get out of this room and call the police," my dad said. My overreacting got the best of me, and I thought about us leaving the room. Were there more people? Were they waiting for us? Were they right outside the door? Or were they hiding and would spring out when we least expected it? Maybe they were still in our apartment, continuing to raid through our things, since they know that we were too scared to leave. Had they heard my mother screaming for help and came back? We searched the room for weapons to protect ourselves with, but we wouldn't find anything even remotely useful. You may be wondering what happened to the gun my mother was shouting about earlier. It never existed. She just said that so the man would hopefully leave out of fear. So with half a pair of broken scissors in my dad's hand, and a small floor fan in my mother's, we prepared ourselves for whatever was on the other side of that door. My dad unlocked the door and swung it open swiftly, hoping to catch anyone out there off guard. The complete silence, mixed with the eerie yellow lighting coming from our hallway, seemed like a scene from a horror movie. Straight ahead, we all noticed that the door to the second floor balcony was wide open, and the screen on the window next to it had been pried open as well. The first feeling to run through me was assurance. Assurance of knowing that I wasn't crazy and hadn't just made it up. The second feeling to run through me was pure dread, knowing that I wasn't crazy and I unfortunately hadn't made it up. We searched the second floor and found no one and nothing. We then moved onto the first floor, and we found our pitcher of water dripping with condensation on the kitchen table. My mother asked me if I had forgotten to put it back before I went to bed, but I distinctly remember only brushing my teeth. I knew I hadn't gotten it out. Our windows have the glass on the outside and the screen on the inside, contradictory to typical American windows. And we saw that the glass windows were wide open and that the screen had been pried with. However, both of the locks on the door were bolted, and the pole was still in place. We figured that the man had initially attempted to come through by putting his hand through the small gap he made in the window screen, trying to reach for the door so that he could unlock it. However, I suppose his calculations were off, and he couldn't make the distance. That's when he climbed up to the second floor, probably by scaling the apartment that the construction workers had yet to finish, and did the same procedure to the balcony window. He was successful this time, because the distance was much shorter. We called 911 a total of 5 times, and it took them 45 minutes to get to our apartment, despite the fact that we live a 3-minute drive away. While waiting, my mother knocked on other apartments to let them know what was going on. Now, our complex consists of 4 different apartments. The first one is rented out to an online business company. The second is rented out to a family who had just moved in that exact night. We're in the third, and the fourth had no tenants. Neither of them answered, and it was probably because it was 2:30 AM. The police came eventually, and told us that someone had made a call earlier, saying that they heard a woman screaming for help, but that they couldn't find the exact location of the screams. They searched the house, but found no one, and didn't even tell us how to file a report. Yeah, they were pretty useless. The next day, my mum spoke to the people at the first apartment, and they were obviously shaken up. They told her that they had heard her knocking, but that it's company policy not to open the door from 10 PM to 6 AM. My mother moved on to apartment 2 and told them what happened, and the man and his pregnant wife said that they didn't hear anything, despite going to bed at 2 AM and having all their windows opened. I was somewhat skeptical, because my scream was pretty loud, even giving my mother nightmares days after the incident, and all our windows and second-story door were open. There's another building just a few feet away, so sound resonates pretty loudly, making the construction booming even behind closed doors. And my mother's screams, that were enough to make someone call the police, I highly doubt they didn't hear anything. With the first apartment it made sense though, and all the windows were closed due to the air conditioning being left on. My mother told the couple to be wary of the construction workers because she believed that they decided to rob us after seeing that my father was a foreigner, automatically assuming that we must be rich or something. The man's face instantly dropped and his tone turned cold. My mother asked him for the landlord's number, since the old number no longer worked, and he said that he would give it to her after he went to see her today, since he didn't have it on him. It took him 4 days to finally give it to us, and he did so with what seemed like a sincere apology, saying sorry for taking so long, and for what happened to us. That same day, we called the landlord, and she seemed shocked, telling us that nothing like that had ever happened in any of her apartments before. However, my mother had spoken with tenants in the apartment complex behind our own, which happened to be owned by the same landlord, and she says that she knows of at least 3 people in her complex who have had their place broken into. Later, the maintenance man came to inspect our windows, and we found out that the construction workers were hired because they're all members of our landlord's church, and the man, who just moved in with his wife, is the bishop of their church. Before my mother could even bring up her theory, the maintenance man told her that he was convinced it was the construction workers. We kept realizing that things were missing over the course of 2 weeks, like my backpack, some sunglasses, money, jewellery, some stuff out of our storage room, as well as other things. My phone was also taken. I assumed that's why he was crouching over my bed. He was trying to reach for both the phone and the charger, since I was probably laying on the wire or something. My laptop and camera were both sitting on my desk next to my jewellery box, but he didn't take those. My parents assume it's because he was going to take the heavier items when he was about to leave, so he wouldn't have to carry them around. However, I didn't see anything in his hand when he was running away from me, which makes me think that he either left the other items by the door for an easy exit, or there was someone else in the house helping him out. A few weird things. He took 4 of my shirts, 2 of them being exactly the same. He also went into my cousin's room and stole her towel. Thankfully, she had gone home for the summer, so she wasn't around, but it almost seemed as if the thief knew that. He went into her room and my room, but completely avoided my parents' room. I also couldn't get over the fact that he drank our water straight from the jug, which would have made sense since he climbed to the 2nd story. However, this country is notorious for being superstitious, and my mum said that thieves tend to leave water out because it makes the homeowners go to deep sleep. Something about water resembling the calming waves of an ocean. I've never been one to believe in superstition, and she thinks that's why I was able to wake up. Just a few hours after the incident, we decided that we were going to move back to the States. This wasn't the only occurrence affecting our decision, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. I'm just thankful that we all came out safe and nothing worse happened. I'm also incredibly grateful for my cat, since he's basically the hero for waking me up. In fact, my cousins are fighting over who'll get to keep him once we leave. Years ago, I used to work at a church as the head sound engineer. The bulk of the job required me to be active during the days for summer services. Occasionally, there would be tasks that would be done whenever I got the chance. One of these tasks would be duplicating CDs of sermons for people who would like a copy to listen at home or in the car. I would get requests for various sermons, sometimes series spanning months, and I would have to make extra time to take care of these duplication requests in the middle of the night. It never bothered me, and I had a key to getting into the church whenever I needed to. One particular night, I headed into the church sometime around 1 or 2 in the morning. Since I know the building like the back of my hand, I rarely turned the lights on inside the building. The ambient light from the street lights would illuminate through the windows, just enough so that I could see where I was going. But beyond that, the building was pitch black. Now, the way the church was laid out, there was a foyer, which then had doors in the church sanctuary, where the services were held. The sanctuary had a balcony, and on this balcony was the sound booth, where the CD duplicator was located. There is only one door to the balcony, which would be locked from the inside, which was always located in the foyer, with the stairs leading up to it. The balcony is completely open, not separated by glass or anything, and provides a completely unobstructed view of the sanctuary below. The pews, the stage, all of it. Acoustically, the room is very good. If someone was on the stage talking, you would easily hear it from the back of the church and balcony. And if for some reason you couldn't see what you were listening to, you could easily make out which part of the room the sound was coming from. This comes into play later. When I reached the top of the stairs to the balcony in the sound booth, I turned on a light so that I could begin working. It's just a single bulb about 15 feet above my head, and I had no need to turn on anything more than that. This was the only light in the entire sanctuary. I know that might seem crazy to some, but this was a building that I had spent hundreds of hours in by myself at night. I felt completely comfortable at the time. I began duplicating CDs, lost in my thoughts at the peaceful silence of the enormous room. After around an hour of silence, a sound abruptly rang out that startled me about 20 to 30 feet ahead and below of me, in the middle of the pews on the left-hand side. I heard a distinctive clink-clink sound. It was subtle but clear, and absolutely unmistakable to me. Over and over, I knew exactly what the sound was. Allow me to explain. In another part of the church, we had a coffee house, of sorts, where people would load up on coffee and donuts every Sunday morning. The coffee was always dispensed in ceramic coffee mugs. Literally, the most basic common mug you can imagine. Your kitchen cupboards are likely most full of them. Anyway, due to the high volume of these mugs that circulated through the church, there were always baristas from the coffee house picking them up from around the church to be washed. Oftentimes they would be missed, and they would lay hidden around the church, as multiple mugs were usually connected in one hand. By the handle, mugs themselves would hit and make that distinctive ceramic clink sound. It became regular background noise before, during, and after services. After about 10 years of working at this church, it's a sound I knew and recognized very well, but I would be lying if I said I ever consciously thought about that particular sound. So I find myself trying to process why I'm hearing coffee mugs clinking in the middle of the night, in the middle of our church sanctuary, in the pitch dark. I stood there, peering from the balcony into the darkness below, trying to make sense of it for several minutes before curiosity got the better of me. I had to figure out what was making the sound. I descended the stairs and into the foyer, where the light switches were, and flipped them all on. I immediately felt better and entered the sanctuary on the ground level. I had pinpointed where the ceramic sound was coming from when I was on the balcony, but unfortunately, now that I was at the source with the lights on, there was nothing to be heard. It was midweek, and the sanctuary had not been cleaned from the previous Sunday, so I knew that there were probably a few coffee mugs still inside. People frequently left them on top of pews, underneath them, and everywhere in between. I walked down each row of pews, carefully scanning for mugs. Nothing. Knowing there would be likely some on the floor, I go down on my hands and knees in the very front of the sanctuary to take a peek. From this perspective, I could see underneath every pew on each retrospective side at once. Sure enough, there were a few mugs scattered throughout the floor, underneath certain pews. I got up and moved to those specific pews and examined where the mug was. In hindsight, I probably should have picked them up. I didn't, because technically it wasn't my job. I did take note of the most important fact at the time. There were no coffee mugs in close proximity to each other. The closest was 3 or 4 feet from another mug, not even remotely close enough to clink together. Whilst I couldn't explain the sound I heard, there was no logical way those mugs could have made those clinks. I had no answers, but I was satisfied enough to just brush it off. I left the sanctuary, turned off the lights at the light switch in the foyer, and returned back up the stairs to the balcony, illuminated by just a single light bulb above me, and consoled by the silence I found myself in once again. I resumed my tasks, and about 15 minutes of productivity had passed when it happened again. Clink, clink. In the same place as before. Clink. My heart stopped, and the hairs on my neck stood up again. Clink, clink, clink. Okay, I had verified this myself. There were no mugs in enough proximity that they could somehow, for the sake of argument, be clinking on their own. They were not clinking on their own. I rushed down the stairs into the foyer and flipped on the lights again. Entering the sanctuary, I dropped to my knees and once again peered underneath the pews. Nothing. I knew this sound. It was unmistakable. I pinpointed where it was coming from, but there was nothing. No sound, nothing in disarray. No mugs that could have been in contact with any other. Spooked but frustrated at the same time, I returned to the foyer. Instead of turning off all the lights, I left one on in the sanctuary. This made 2 lights now, one in the balcony and one in the sanctuary. The addition of this light helped set me a little more at ease as I walked through the balcony door to the bottom of the stairs. I locked it from the inside. I don't know what was going on, and maybe I was being a little paranoid at this point, but I wasn't going to take any chances. I went up the stairs once again to attempt to finish my task on the balcony. About half an hour of silence had elapsed, just enough for me to settle the idea of nothing weird happening for the rest of the night. Then it happened again. Clink, clink. Might as well have been a gunshot. I stood up and scanned from atop the balcony. There was twice as much light in there now, and enough to illuminate the room, even if it was still dim. But there was nothing. Nobody was playing a prank. There were no ghouls, spectres, or shadow people dancing around. No big, aha, revelation. Clink. It continued. And so did I. I wanted to go home, so I ignored it. The sooner I finished duplicating these stupid CDs, the sooner I could get out of this damn church and get some sleep. Clink, clink, clink. Again and again. Maybe about 15 minutes, maybe about another half hour or so. I lost track of time. All that I know is that eventually, it stopped. The silence returned. At one point, I resolved that all of it was ridiculous. There had to be a rational explanation, and as such, it was stupid to hold up on my locked balcony. I went downstairs to get a drink, and on my way back, I flipped off the remaining light in the sanctuary. No need to waste electricity. I reasoned, I'm not going to let some stupid sound dictate fear all night. I returned to the balcony and left the door unlocked, illuminated once more by my single light bulb. I popped in a few more CDs, and then it happened. I don't even know how to effectively describe it, at least in a way that captures the immediacy and sheer terror of it. All at once, the entire room began to shake violently, with a deep, bassy rumble. There are no earthquakes in this part of the country, so that was immediately ruled out. Time seemed to stop as I scanned around trying to figure out what was going on. I looked at the soundboard. You know those LEDs they have going from green to yellow to red? The thing was maxed out red, indicating it was being overloaded by some sort of input. But there were no mics plugged in, no amps turned on, and no sound coming out of the speakers. I don't even think the speakers were plugged in, and if they were muted. At the time, I had done professional audio for over 5 years, and this wasn't something technical. The entire sanctuary rumbled and shook, and after about 30 seconds, it stopped. There was complete silence. I was completely shaken, and I bolted out of the church and went home. I don't have any explanation for what happened, since there were no ghostly things to show themselves or anything super paranormal. I have tried to explain it with logic, but alas. This house I live in is only a couple of 100 meters away from a small church in a suburb. Although I was brought up a Christian, I was never truly religious, and I only went to said church whenever my parents took me as a kid. My father died when I was a teenager, and we stopped going as a family altogether. After that, I only went whenever my friends asked me to tag along. Now I'm 21, and I only pass by the church whenever I had to go into the city, because there's a dirt road beside it that leads to the parking lot behind, adjacent to a major road where it was easy to get a bus to work. It was closer than the village gate in the opposite direction, and I had to only ride one bus from there. I am not an easily scared man, nor have I previously experienced long-lasting trauma after being spooked, and I'm here to tell you that what I saw besides that church 3 months ago still haunts me to my core. A storm was announced to hit earlier that week, but leaving for work that early Thursday morning, the skies were clear, and not a single cloud to cover the starry sky. So I didn't bring an umbrella. I climbed over the parking lot gate because it was chained shut until 6 for the first mass. The guard at the outpost didn't mind because they knew my family well. I work at a hotel as a line cook, and it's a very demanding job. I have to leave home before the sun rises most days, and I work until long after it's set. The only time I get to see the sun is if I'm assigned to the station at a buffet, where I have a view of the poolside. It was an average, overworked and underpaid kind of day for me. I wasn't assigned at the buffet. I stayed in the kitchen, where there weren't any windows, so I was surprised to see the flooded streets when I clocked out. Apparently it had been raining heavily all afternoon, and although it had subsided around sunset, there was still a mild drizzle out. It was around 8 in the evening when I left the hotel, and in my country, flooded streets meant standstill traffic for at least a couple of hours. This wasn't that uncommon. I had dealt with similar situations before, and it also meant I could sleep on the bus, so it wasn't too upsetting. Fast forward to around midnight and it's pouring again. I'm not too far off from the church parking lot, so I decide to get off the bus and start walking, because it hadn't budged for the last 10 minutes. I put my phone and wallet in my waterproof backpack, which also contained a spare shirt, my house keys, and my knife set. I don't mind getting wet, and around this time the parking lot gate was already chained shut, but I climb over it like I usually do. It was flooded knee deep in the parking lot, and there was no security guard at the outpost. I figured he retreated into the church. It's dark, but I focus on the small lights from the house in the distance. They only look like dots from that far. I trudge my way through the open parking lot that could have passed as a kiddie-friendly pool, when I heard this strange sloshing at the far corner of my left. Due to the heavy rain, I couldn't clearly make out what was there, but I knew that I wasn't alone. All the lights to the lot were shut, and the only thing to guide me were a few lights of the houses far ahead and my memory of the area's landscape. It's a straight shot from the dirt road, so I didn't have to worry about a light source. The sound of all the falling raindrops accumulated into dull static noise, so it was easy for me to hear that there was something going on in the corner. I could see the shape of a person who seemed to be sitting down, so I could only see them from the waist up. As I got closer, and my eyes better adjusted into the dark, I could tell that it was a woman, because of her long hair and curvy outline. She was flailing her arms and splashing the water around, grunting as she pounded her fists into the water. She was about 2 cars' length away, and I wasn't too concerned about it. I've dealt with crazy people before. I glanced over a few times as I passed her, and then got to the dirt road. Quite unnerving. She was out my line of sight, and at this point the mud made it quite hard to walk. Water was only ankle deep, but I kept having to jerk my foot free after each step because my shoes would sink into the mud. A small splash made me look over my shoulder, and in the darkness of that road, the woman was splayed out, face first in shallow water. I froze, thinking whether or not I should help her. I hate the thought of being the guy who let someone drown in 6 inches of water, and she was about 10 steps away from me, and before I could decide what to do, she started to move. It was too dark to see any details, but her outline was distinguishable enough for me to see that she was looking up at me. She slowly got on her hands and feet, like she was about to stand, but her hand lingered on the ground with her rump in the air. I was already scared pale at this point, My legs didn't work, and I thought of reaching for my knives, but I was honestly too afraid to move. And then she starts crawling towards me on her hands and feet. This sent a jolt through me, and all of a sudden I'm sprinting towards my house. I could hear the splashes behind me along with her coarse breathing, almost like she was coughing, and my eyes started to fill with tears, and the rage against my face made the light in the distant houses blurry. But I knew at that point that I was running for my life. I couldn't tell if she was catching up, but I didn't have to look back. I heard her yell in a voice so rough it resembled a pig squeal. Short, sharp and loud. A wordless shout of anger. I believe that it was the fastest I've ever ran in my life, and at this point I couldn't hear anything but the rain, deafening, unrelenting, and violent. My house was close. I sped by a few houses with their dim porch lights, and I could tell that I was running on asphalt. I didn't know when it happened, but apparently I lost my shoes back at the dirt road. One last bend, and I was at my doorstep. I forcefully tore open my backpack zipper and fumbled around inside for a key, frantically looking around to see if she was still chasing me. I got in the house, slammed the door shut, and collapsed. I don't recall what happened for the rest of the night, but I woke up next morning in my bed. My older brother filled me in. He was awake when I got home that night, and went to the front door when the noise alerted him. He said I was on my knees, leaning against the door and quietly sobbing to myself. He awoke my mum, and they were trying to console me, but I wouldn't speak. They tried to ask me questions, but I would just shake my head. They got me some dry clothes and led me to bed. Over breakfast, I explained what happened, and my mum said she would notify the village guards. I could tell that they were concerned for my safety, but they didn't understand the fear that I felt. My brother even joked about it. I didn't go to work that day. In fact, I took the rest of the week off because I caught a fever. The guard did a minor investigation and even increased patrol for a while, but they didn't find anything but my shoes in the parking lot. When I did get better, I started taking the long walk to the main village gate to work. Going home, I now carpool with a buddy who can get me close enough home that I don't have to use the dirt road route. The days that he can't drive me, I take a taxi, even if it hurts my pocket a bit. I can't walk alone without glancing over my shoulder every 5 seconds. Suddenly loud noises make my heart jump, and I can't stand the sound of rain. I've been getting better though, and I can sleep with the lights off now. I just wish I could stop seeing the crawling woman's shape when I start drifting off to sleep. I wish I could tell you more about her. I honestly do. Because it's one thing to be afraid of things, but when you lack the understanding of what you fear, your mind fills in the blanks with terrifying detail. A few years ago, my husband worked the night shift. He typically got home around 6 AM, and he worked a 45-minute drive away. One night, I decided to let my 2 kids watch a movie in my bed on the laptop. It was already fairly late, around 10 PM, so I figured they'd fall asleep, and that they could just stay in my bed that night. I locked up the whole house, and everyone got ready for bed, and we started the movie. About 40 minutes into it, I heard someone walk through the dining room. My room is directly off the dining room, and it has hardwood flooring, so it's pretty easy to hear the footsteps. I leave the dining room light on for my husband, so I had my door closed almost all the way save for an inch to block the light. I figured he'd come home early and continued watching the movie. After 5 minutes of hearing someone walk back and forth across the dining room and didn't come in, I decided to find out what was up. I paused the movie, told the kids to stay put, and opened the door. The footsteps immediately stopped and no one was there. I looked all over the house, checked every window, closet and outside. Everything was still locked, and nothing was out of place. Then I heard a meow and laughed at myself for freaking out over the cat, until I walked into the kitchen to feed him, and he was sitting outside on the back porch, and the door is locked. Then my husband called from work, 45 minutes away, because a neighbor had their house broken into a couple of streets over earlier that day. I lost it and started crying. I was terrified. My cousin lives in a hostel with 10 other girls in one room. All of them were gone, except for her and the girl who sleeps in the bed across from hers. I understand my cousin's hostel is near a forest. You must understand that Malaysia is 62% forest, so this is not uncommon. It was around 10 PM at night, and my cousin was lying down in bed, watching K-drama on her phone with low volume without headphones. Out of nowhere, her roommate called out to her. She paused the video to look at her friend, and her friend had a very fearful face. "What's wrong?" she asked her, and her friend's gaze turned over towards the window of their room before my cousin looked back. "You didn't hear that?" she asked. There was a silence, but my cousin couldn't hear a thing, and she shrugged. "No, I heard nothing." And then it was quiet again. Her roommate's eyes lit up when she stood up. "There it is again! It's still there! You don't hear that!" she half shouted at my cousin. My cousin, getting freaked out, tried to listen for anything, but still heard nothing. "It's a Pontiac. It's laughing outside. How can you not hear that?" She immediately jumps back in bed and curls up under her blankets in fear. Hearing that sent chills up my cousin's spine. But she still couldn't hear anything. "I think you're just imagining things," she says to her and attempts to watch her video again. Her roommate protests, but both didn't leave each other until the rest of their friends returned that night. Although they didn't see the Pontiac that night, something else happened a few days later. 2 of her roommates were in the bathroom around 8, and they noticed that one of the stalls were occupied, but the door wasn't locked. They could see someone's feet as they walked in, so they assumed it was one of the students who lived in the hostel as well. But as they approached the stall, they saw through the slit that it was my cousin. She was sitting there on the toilet, doing nothing. They spoke to her and asked if she was okay, but she didn't reply. They just shrugged it off, and they went back into the room, assuming that she'd probably be back in a few minutes. They went directly into the room, and the moment they walked in, they stopped, because my cousin was sitting there on her bed doing work. "Didn't I just see you in the bathroom?" one of the roommates asked. My cousin looks at her weirdly and shakes her head. "I don't go into the bathroom alone. You know that. I've been here the whole time," she says. Both of her roommates felt chills up their spines, because they knew that they'd just seen her before they left. And even if she ran out of the bathroom to get to the room first, there was no way she could have done so without them seeing. So it was freaky that they saw a spirit that copied the way my cousin looked. Could it have been the same one? This happened just last night, and honestly I'm still a little shaken up over it. I work evenings as a dispatcher in a medium-sized city in the Midwest. I was driving home at 2 AM when I stopped for gas. In retrospect, it was stupid to have stopped at all. The gas station was poorly lit and completely empty of any other customers, but I knew the shady areas of town and this was not usually one of them. As I was pumping gas, I noticed a middle-aged woman sitting on the curb across the parking lot. It was a cold night, and it had just started raining. The woman was not wearing any weather-appropriate clothing, and she looked drenched. When the woman saw that I was watching her, she called out to me from across the parking lot. My second of many stupid decisions that night was choosing to engage her. I was worried for her, so I approached her to see if I could sort out some help. "Hi, beautiful. I'm just trying to get home, but no one will help me," she said. "The place I want to go costs $60 in a cab, and I only have 40. Would you mind helping me out?" I don't usually give money to panhandlers, but this woman seemed genuine. The weather was terrible, and my job centers around helping people, so I agreed. I told her that I couldn't give her any cash, but if she would come inside, I'd take out some money from the ATM and give her a few dollars. But the ATM wasn't working, so I apologized and told her there was nothing else I could do for her. She followed me back outside, idly chatting with me as I opened my driver door to get in, and then she got in my car. I was too shocked to really say anything. I sat staring at her as she buckled herself into the passenger seat. As soon as I got into my car, her demeanor changed entirely. She no longer seemed forlorn as much as she did extremely excited and restless. "Just take me to my aunt's," she said. "She can give you money." Of course, alarm bells were going off in my head. Although my first instinct was to tell her to get out of my car, my gut tells me that it would be dangerous. She's already proven to be unpredictable. She seemed to be high, and I didn't know if she had any concealed weapons. Forcing her out of my vehicle, I thought had the potential to elicit a violent action. "Where are you asking me to take you?" I finally said. "Just start driving and I'll tell you where to turn." "No. If you want me to consider driving you anywhere, I will need you to tell me where we're going," I say, with no real intention of driving her anywhere. "Don't worry, honey, I'm not going to rob you. Just drive." "No," I repeat. I was asking her questions and she got really agitated. We still had not left the gas station parking lot, and I considered getting out of the car and going into the gas station for help. But she seemed to know and be friendly with one attendant that was inside when I tried to get the money, and I really wasn't about to leave her alone in my car. Finally, she snapped at me and said, "Why are you asking me so many questions? I thought we were friends. Don't you trust me?" "I work at a police department," I say. "It's my job to ask these sort of questions." And she flipped out, started yelling at me about being a snitch and trying to get her in trouble, and just generally losing her damn mind. At this point, I'm more scared than ever. I just want her gone, but my instinct still told me that asking her to get out of my car wouldn't work, so I decided to take a risk. "I'm not a police officer. I just work at a police department. Why don't I take you to Walmart and see if they have any ATMs that work?" My idea was to get her out of my car peacefully as possible, and then lose her in the store. She liked my idea, and immediately calmed down. I knew that driving off with this woman in my car was incredibly risky, but it seemed like my best option at the time. As we were driving, she keeps talking to me. Her thoughts were erratic, bouncing all over the place. It sometimes seemed difficult to follow through one thought, but this is roughly how our conversation went. "I'm glad we're friends now. I have about 5 or 6 people trying to get me. I'm going to come to your work tomorrow so that we can arrest them together." "Okay, we can talk about that tomorrow. Tonight, you said we're trying to get you home." "Yes, honey, I'm trying to get to Rochester." "Rochester? I thought you needed to go to Medway." Yeah, Medway, that's what I meant. That's why the cab ride is $40. It's far away." "The cab ride is $40? Yeah, baby. You said you have $40. I do, baby. I have $40, but the cab ride is $60. And then there was silence. Are you sure you can't take me to my aunt's house? She lives close to Baker Street. I thought you said she lived close to Shirley Street. No, baby, I meant Baker Street, but it doesn't matter because she won't give me money anyways. You sure you can't take me to Medway? It was terrifyingly obvious that this woman was utterly full of shit, because the details of her story were constantly changing. When we pulled into the Walmart parking lot, she finally got out of my car, but only after I got out first, and then she followed me into the store. I told her before we went in that I needed to use the restroom. My plan was to call the police from inside the store, but she followed me into the bathroom, and that's when things got really weird. She grabbed the crook of my arm and whispered in my ear, "If you don't have any money, that's okay. But we can get a bit freaky in here if you like." I told her no as forcefully as I could manage, bolted into a stool and locked the door as fast as I possibly could. As soon as I had a barrier between us, I said, "You know, I have some friends in the police department that could probably help you better than I can. I'm just going to call them and maybe we can figure this out together." Again, at the mention of the cops, she started screaming at me. I just kept reiterating that the police could help her, and she snapped at me that she was just going to leave and stormed out the bathroom. But it wasn't over. I waited to make sure she was really gone. Sure enough, not 60 seconds after she left, she came back in the bathroom and started banging on the store door and said something that scared me more than anything else. "Hey, come back with me to your car. I left my beer in your car." I blatantly tell her no. I saw her get into my car and she had absolutely nothing on her other than the clothes on her back. And after that, she left the bathroom again and didn't come back. I waited a good 5 minutes before exiting the bathroom, and I immediately found a manager who called the police for me. Thankfully, I was in a different police jurisdiction than the one I worked in, because I was mortified at how entirely stupid I had been the entire night, and would have died of embarrassment if any of my co-workers had responded. The officer that responded took my statement and advised me to be more careful in future. He said that sometimes panhandlers turn violent, and that just recently there had been a report of a woman who matched my description assaulting a good Samaritan that stopped to try to help her. I definitely learnt my lesson on stranger danger, and I'm lucky to have come out unscathed. I'm glad that my stupidity didn't kill me. So next time you try and help a stranger late at night, don't. Back in the early/mid 1970s, my mother and I lived in the Pacific Northwest, and I was around 6 years old. We were on an offbeat road out of Seattle. Very dark night, no moon and a wisp of fog. We saw a Volkswagen Beetle on the side of the road, with the emergency flashes on, and a rather good-looking guy, as my mother describes him, with his arm in a sling waving us down. My mother pulled over, being a kind woman that would help anybody in need, as he looked quite normal. My mother rolled down her window and asked if she could help, and the guy asked my mum if she could help him get the last lug nut off his tire so that he could change his flat. And he says, "Hello, my name is Ted," and then smiles and looked at me and reached over and shook my hand and asked my name. And I got a bad vibe, and I said nothing to him. My mum said something about his smile really made her uncomfortable, and then she noticed that he was missing the passenger seat in his Beetle. She rolls the window back up and said that she would call a tow truck to come and help him at the next city, then speeds off whilst looking in her rearview mirror and sees him taking off the sling and getting back in the Beetle, and took off very fast in the opposite direction. So that's the night that 6-year-old me shook the hand of Ted Bundy. My aunt is single and a workaholic, so she has the habit of coming home late. The latest she would usually get home is around 11 PM, and the earliest would be about 5. She would alternate days in which she would come home early because it wasn't exactly safe to drive home at night, especially since she lives with my grandparents, who live deep within a village, with the only roads leading into it are very long and lonely. Not to mention that she would have to drive by 2 very large lakes, as well as 2 large palm estates just to reach home. Keep in mind that hijackers nor thieves are her only concern whilst driving alone at night. Here in Malaysia, it is believed that evil spirits dwell in places with water, like lakes, oceans and rivers. So, if we pass by one at night, we are supposed to throw out a piece of small trash out of our car window, just a few meters away from our home. This is to make sure that an evil spirit does not follow us home and will only stop by that piece of trash. Don't ask me why I believe this, but I do. But my aunt doesn't do this, so of course something did end up following her home. One week, my aunt wasn't going with her original schedule of mixing up the times of going home. For 4 days straight, she drove home at exactly 11:30 p.m, except for Friday. That one night, she had to stay until 1:30 a.m. When she got home, she felt something strange. She got out of her car and felt as if she were being watched. Not just ordinary watched, like something with evil intentions was staring at her in hatred. She immediately locked her car, closed the gate, and walked straight towards the front door. As she opened it, she noticed that all the lights in the house were on, and I mean every light. She saw my 2 cousins who were staying over for the holidays, curled up with each other on the bed in the living room. She approached them and asked them what was wrong, as they appeared to have fear in their eyes, and they confessed that they were staying up because they thought they heard something and were getting afraid, so waited for her to arrive. My 2 cousins and grandmother were sitting in the kitchen where the front door is. They were talking to each other, and all were waiting for my aunt to arrive home. It was around 11 p.m. when they heard someone turn the doorknob, before inserting the key and unlocking the door. My cousins and grandmother waited for my aunt to open the door, but nothing happened. My grandmother waited and called for my aunt's name, but there was no answer. Terrified, my cousins went to turn all the lights on in the house and went to the living room to keep an eye on all the doors in the house. My grandmother went to make sure that all the doors were locked in the house. They told my aunt that they really thought it was her, because it made the exact same noises that my aunt does when she arrives home, jingling the doorknob before inserting the keys and unlocking the door and everything. My cousins thought it was someone trying to break in, but nothing else happened for the rest of the night. When my aunt told this to my mother, I felt chills around my body. My aunt says she might know who or what exactly it was, and she blames herself for it. She knew that it was one kind of evil spirit that she must have accidentally brought home from the lakes because of her consistent timing and getting home late that night during the week. Whatever followed her home mimicked exactly the way she'd done before entering the house. The good thing is that my grandmother didn't try and open the door, because if she did, she would have let in the evil spirit. And God only knows what would have happened if she actually did. Ever since that experience, she immediately resumed her normal schedule of alternating the times, because she didn't want another one following her home. My story takes place 19 years ago. I am a female and was 16 at the time. I'm 5'7", and I was around 130 pounds, and I like to think that I'm strong. but I couldn't take on 2 young men. So it begins, with my mother and stepfather going away on vacation and leaving my 17-year-old sister and I home alone. They did this quite often. My parents were not winning any parenting awards. My sister and I didn't get along either. She was a nasty piece of work, and luckily, she decided to go stay at a friend's house while my parents were away. I was nervous about being alone, so I had my boyfriend stay with me. He was a pugnacious dickhead, but I'm glad he was there. So one night, Brett and I were at my house, and we had just started messing around when I heard a really loud knock at the door. My room was in the basement, but at the landing area between the stairs, there was a window that I could see the stairs that led up into the alcove of our front porch, and I could see 2 people standing there. And just as I was peeking out to see them better, one of them saw me. I remember feeling the breath sucked out of my chest. There were 2 young men standing on my front porch. It was almost midnight, and I had no idea who the hell they were. The guy that saw me let his friend know, and they both looked in the window and asked me to come to the door. My boyfriend had gone upstairs to open the door, and I remember freaking out because I told him not to go. I didn't know these people. He was one of those guys who thought he was Mr. Tough Guy and believed that he could fight anyone. He was telling the guys to leave, and just as I joined him at the door, they saw me and called me by name and asked for me to let them in. Brett told them to go away. One guy, I think his name was Wes or Les or something like that, said to come outside and that he just wanted to talk to my boyfriend. I said no thank you, we're going to bed, and shut the door. I was really confused and getting quite frightened. They stood on my doorstep for a few minutes, and then started knocking again. Wes, or Les, explained to me through the door that he was my sister's friend, and that she had told him that I was home alone, and they should come by. I knew my sister, and I believed them. That did not, however, make me stupid. I told them to leave, and they started kicking the door. It was shaking, and I was seriously fearing that it wouldn't hold up. I was so scared that I ran into my kitchen to call the police. I was assured that they would be there very soon, and to lock the doors and to stay on the phone. Meanwhile, Brett was still yelling at them, which only served to piss these guys off more, and I begged for him to shut up, but he would not listen to me. I was locking all the doors and windows upstairs, while Brett went down to check on the doors. Down in the basement, there was a huge mudroom area, and it had a thick wooden door made of 2x4 planks, kind of like a barn door. The door had a big old lock on it, and some spring-loaded turnbolt, and also had a plank to set across it, like a barricade. One of the guys was pounding on this door, and Brett heard him tell the other to try the back door. This stupid door was one of those 1960s things that had a happy little square window right at face level, with a little curtain across it. I was at this door, trying to jam a chair under the flimsy knob, when I looked up and saw an unnamed guy looking at me. I screamed, and the dispatcher asked me if I was okay. I barely squeaked out that one of the guys was looking right at me through the window. He was older than me, probably about 20, and he was tall, and he looked scary as hell. His dark eyes were drilling into me, and he wore this creepy, placid smile on his face. I had never seen this man before, but he knew my name. He tapped on the window with one finger, never breaking eye contact, and said, "Becky, let me in." I couldn't breathe. The knob was rattling as he was messing with it. He said again, "Let me in, Becky. I just want to see if you're okay. I just want to talk." He stared at me. I didn't say a word. I was just 3 feet from him, with my back pressed to the fridge, when suddenly he started beating on the door and screamed, "Let me into this house. If I have to break in, I will kill both of you. So just open the door." He looked maniacal. There was this loud knock on the front door. He gave me the most hateful sneer I'd ever seen, and I heard shouting, and he ran back downstairs and into the woods along the back of my yard. Brett had gone to the door, and it was the cops. There were 2 female officers at the front, and one was just starting to raise her voice, asking where I was when I came to the door too. I was so relieved. I started sobbing, and told them that they had run away through the woods. Luckily, the woods were not very deep. They actually ran along the bank of a large river, and there was just a bridge up there from where the woods met the road. One officer ran around the back, whilst the other stayed to get a full description and take my statements. The first officer came back and spoke with the second one, and she said that she saw them running across the bridge. They both left in a hurry. They hopped in the cruiser and sped off. I was still crying and shaking, but I was absolutely furious at Brett for riling them up. I went to make myself some tea, thinking of all the ways I could kill my sister when she got home. I had so much anger, fear, and adrenaline pumping through me. I could have ripped her to shreds at that very moment. 20 minutes later, the cruiser came back, and there were 2 guys sitting in the back seat, and the officers wanted me to confirm it was the right guys. I looked through the window and saw them. They still looked terrifying to me. They were in cuffs and couldn't get to me. But I would not get close to them. Neither would look at me, and I confirmed it was them. We spoke for a bit, and I told the cops about my sister, suggesting that these 2 men should come see me. The second officer wasn't impressed. I pressed charges for attempted forced entry, property damage, as they had broken a window in the living room, trespassing, disorderly conduct, and attempted assault. Initially, they both pleaded not guilty, but later admitted to some of the charges, and they both got 18 months in jail, and were forbidden from contacting me or my boyfriend ever again, and to be at least 500 meters from me at all times. I never heard from them again. I confronted my sister about it, and of course she denied it. Then laughed about it, laughed at me. She was an awful person. I have no idea what their true intentions were, as they maintained that they were only there to talk to me. I'm thankful that I didn't have to find out. So 2 strangers who just wanted to talk at midnight, let's not meet again. This happened to me back when I was 10 years old, and I was walking to my friend's house. It was on a Saturday around noontime, and my friend lived about a 5-minute, if not less, walk away from my house. About halfway through the walk, a rainstorm came out of nowhere, and being 10 years old, just wanting to get to my friend's house, I decided against running back for a jacket. When I reached the street off my friend's street, an inconspicuous white van pulled up beside me. The sliding door swung open, and a lady in her early 30s asked me if I wanted a ride. as it was raining outside and I had no jacket. Being a very safe kid, I told her that I was going to a friend's house just up the street and that I would be fine. She responded by insinuating that I had to get in with them and that they would drive me. A little backstory on the van. In my southern Ontario city at the time, there was a constant news report of, and I kid you not, a white van abducting numerous children. And I believe that one of the children believed to be abducted by this van was actually killed. They were described as a white Dodge Caravan, and I always remembered this because it was the same type of van that my mother drove, but she drove a blue one. Anyway, back to the story. So, as I told the van that I was fine, the remembrance of the story of the white van sparked into my mind. The van was known by the locals as Old Grump, as an elderly man with a forwards ball cap was always seen driving it, and I was absolutely mortified when I looked towards the driver's seat to see an old man with a ball cap at the wheel. I'm even getting chills just thinking about this, let alone being alone on a street with these creeps in front of me. When I noticed the old man, I remembered more details of the van, the obstructed or non-existent plates, and considering I was about 2 feet away from the back of the van, I glanced to look at the license plates, which are obscured by a garbage bag. The total time elapsed between the van pulling up and me saying no, the lady trying to get me inside, and the realization of the situation was probably around 45 seconds. When I realized what could possibly happen, I told her that I really had to go, and I darted out of there. I have never moved so fast in my entire life. As I began to run, I heard the lady curse and the door come whirring shut. The van began to accelerate again, but luckily for me, after cutting across a few lawns, I was maybe 20 meters from my friend's house. As I reached my friend's house, I recall jumping over the water runoff between his and his neighbor's house and coming to their porch staircase. Now, most houses in my area have maybe 2 to 4 steps and then their front door, but my friend living in a condo had about 15 steps, and their door being about 2 meters off the ground. I sped up the steps as fast as I could, pounded on his door, and looked through the glass and saw him walking slowly towards the door. At this point I was screaming for Cody to open the door, and then turned around to see the van just arriving across the street, perhaps 2 or 3 doors down in this suburban neighborhood, and about 50 feet away. My friend perked up and bolted towards the door, quickly unlocking it, and I rushed inside. To save some time, I summarized the story to him. We were both 10 years old, and just intended on an afternoon of playing some Tom and Jerry style Street Fighter on PS2, when this whole ordeal happened. We panicked, and we didn't know what to do. His parents were not home and neither were mine, and we wouldn't dare go outside to fetch help from the neighbors. We were on the border of calling the police, and this is when it gets really messed up. We picked up the phone, but the line was dead. There would be no calling the police. It sounds extremely bullshit, but the area was only a few months old, so the phone and internet was extremely unpredictable. And now, with that harsh weather, it was no surprise that the line went dead. We lay down on his living room floor, as it hid us out of sight and allowed us to look out the front window. We had began peering outside with a pair of mini binoculars that he had in his room. My friend handed them to me, and I brought them to my eyes. I look outside, and to my surprise no one was in the van anymore. It was completely empty. I handed them to my friend, and he stopped his breathing. I remember whispering to him, "What is it, dude?" And then before he answered, banging began on his garage door. We almost pissed ourselves, and were on the verge of crying. My buddy Cody was frozen solid, and we didn't know what to do. Considering it was a condo, the living room being 15 feet away from the door, and we could hear everything. We heard the handle on the garage being fumbled with, so we grabbed kitchen knives and proceeded down the stairs silently. And when we got to the bottom of the first flight of stairs, Cody remembered in a moment of panic that his dad's uncle lived in the bottom flat of the condo and would possibly be home. We pushed open the door and began calling out his name, Brian, but he wasn't there. We were petrified, but felt a sense of security because we had 2 big kitchen knives. With our knives, we proceeded into the garage. Scared, my heart was racing so fast that these creeps might hear it. We silently listened to the noises outside from the garage, communicating in gestures. The attempts to gain entry to the house were sporadic, and occurred over a time frame of about 15 to 20 minutes. Eventually, everything ceased. I held my breath, and my heart stopped beating. And after about 20 seconds of staring at the garage handle, we hear a single word. Shit. It was the voice of a man. After standing there in shock and fear, afraid to move, we gathered the courage to make our way back upstairs. A few minutes later, there was a ring at the door. My heart dropped, and I'm certain my nuts did too. We proceeded cautiously with knives in hand when we peered through the peephole. We saw a Rogers worker, which is a telephone company here in Canada, with a clipboard. We opened the door and bombarded this guy with questions, eventually amounting to asking if he was the one trying to enter the house. He wasn't. From behind him we saw the van start up and then drive away. I have many aunts and uncles, and each of them have their own creepy experiences while working at one point in their lives. The one that I remember the most is the one that told me the stories of her working late at night at an old factory in the middle of nowhere. This was before she was married. There are several incidents that had occurred in that factory regarding the paranormal. My aunt only told me 3 of them, and all of them happened in the women's bathroom. My aunt has to work during the dead hours of the night with few other female workers to help organize documents for the factory. There were only about 5 or 6 of them at work in the office area, so the rest of the factory was dead silent. One night, my aunt wanted to use the bathroom, so she left alone since the bathroom was right down the hall. As she was in there, she heard the main door open. She thought it was one of her colleagues, and then she heard the stall door at the very end slam shut. The way the stall was closed was by no means ordinary. It was a big slam, loud, intentional. It was quiet for a few seconds before another door slammed shut, equally as loud. She immediately felt a chill up her spine when she heard the 3rd door being slammed, and when the store door next to her slammed shut, she bolted out of there. She didn't look back or anything, and just immediately ran back to the office with her pants halfway down her legs. She indecently burst into the office, terrified, and her colleagues all stare at her. They were all there. No one had left the office ever since she had. They all asked her what's wrong, and she said that she heard something slamming the store doors over and over. They said that they'd heard it too, but assumed it was her doing. Perhaps she was venting her frustration. She denied it, and said that it wasn't her, and she's not sure who did it. But, in truth, she didn't want to know. On another occasion, another one of her colleagues was in the bathroom fixing up her hijab alone. The bathroom stalls were all open and empty, and she can see them all through the mirror except for the one at the very end. She was minding her own business, and she kept on hearing scuffling and ruffling noises coming from somewhere in the bathroom. She had heard something being torn before another odd noise. She stops and looks around to see if maybe another one of her colleagues came in without her noticing. When she saw nothing around her, she finally realized that the noise was coming from the very stall that she couldn't see inside of. Slowly and scared, she approaches the stall to see what's going on. When she reaches close enough to see inside through the mirror, her heart stops, her body goes cold, and her face turns whiter than a sheet. In the bathroom, she sees a small childlike spirit with long frizzy hair crouching over the toilet, eating away at the trash. She can see blood dripping down its hands as it devours the period pads that were in the can. Alarms went off in her head, and she immediately backed away and ran all the way back to the office and told her colleagues about the incident. Let's just say they all decided to leave earlier than usual that night. The last one is of another colleague of my aunt. She was alone in the bathroom, fixing her hair, and was about to leave when she felt a presence next to her. She turned her head and saw a woman who looked exactly like her. And when her colleagues came in to see what was wrong, the figure was gone. She decided to go home immediately after the incident. I'll start off by saying I'm a plump girl, around 5'3" and 24 years old. I had just gotten out of a 3-year relationship and was feeling a little lonely and just wanted to have some fun. My friend convinced me to download Plenty of Fish, which is a free dating app. Against my better judgment, I downloaded the app and spent 2 hours messaging idiots and was ready to give up. Then, a seemingly nice Asian guy named John messaged me. He seemed to say all the right things and was super cute, but I had a weird feeling in my stomach. Something was telling me that it was just too good to be true. My friend told me that I was being paranoid and that we should meet up because I needed to get out of the house. Reluctantly, I took her advice and asked if he wanted to catch a movie, since he only lived 1 town away. He messaged me back a little too quickly for my liking and said that he would love to. John also had a request. He wanted me to accompany him to get a small tattoo before the movie. I thought it was a little weird, but I agreed. The morning of the date, he texted me and said all of a sudden the age transmission on his car blew out, and that I would have to give him a ride if he still wanted us to go. This raised several red flags, but I stupidly agreed. When I picked him up, he seemed to be nervous because he was shaking quite a bit. I asked him if he was okay, and thinking maybe the issue with the car caused him to get into an accident. John said that the transmission on his car blew out 3 years ago, but it was only this morning that he told me it had happened. I looked at him very confused and felt the feeling in my stomach get 10 times stronger. John smiled widely and instantly tried making out with me. I pushed him away and asked him what he thought he was doing, and he said in the creepiest voice, "You're just so beautiful," and tried again. Mind you, he was doing this whilst I was driving, and I realized the mistake I had made, and I just wanted him to go away. He told me to pull into Popeyes in order for him to get some food. I agreed, thinking he was going to get out, but he told me to use the drive-thru. I tried to convince him, telling him that going into the store it would be way faster, but he squinted at me and wasn't buying it. He said, "They always try to get away." And at this point, I was feeling my heartbeat in my throat and felt tears welling up in my eyes, and asked who, but he didn't answer. I knew I should have tried not to cry, but I wear my heart on my sleeve. He looked at me as if I were crazy and said, "I know you're cheating, but I can't stay mad at you. Let's just get to my tattoo and skip to the movie. I want to take you home to make you feel good." I tried pulling myself together, but I swear I was on the brink of a panic attack, because I had a complete maniac in my car. I drove to the tattoo parlor and tried acting as if things were normal until we got inside. I know you're wondering, why did I go in? Well, before he exited the car, he squinted at me and reached over and turned off the car and took the keys. Now he was a very large guy, about 6'4" and 189 pounds, and I was in no position to take anything from him or make him get out. When we got to the tattoo parlor, I tried discreetly asking for help, but they thought I was joking. They seemed to be friends with him and were blocking my path to the door, and I couldn't help but think I was going to die there. They demanded I sit down, so I did. While sitting and contemplating how I got there, I heard what sounded like scaffolding, so I stood up to look, and I saw John, and he looked absolutely insane. He was wielding a crazy-looking hunting knife. Once everyone was backed against the wall, he made a mad dash for me, screaming, "This'll teach you for cheating, you crazy bitch." I was bewildered. I couldn't scream or move. One of the tattoo artists tackled him just before he got to me, and he threw me the keys and told me to get out. I didn't need to be told again. I unlocked the door and ran for my life, and I drove out of there like I was auditioning for Fast and Furious. When I rounded the corner, I was pulled over, and when the cop came up to my window, I burst into tears and told him what happened. Apparently John was a well-known psycho in that town. The cop comforted me as best he could, and escorted me to the police station to make a report. He told me to change my number, which I did, and to delete my social media. I didn't exactly listen. I thought the change in number would be enough, and when I arrived home, I told my friend what happened, and she said I should have been able to tell he was crazy from the picture. Clearly she has no understanding of mental illness. Pictures don't do it justice, and long story short, we're not friends anymore. A few months had passed and I thought everything would go back to normal, but I was receiving calls from a strange number, and eventually found out it was John. He started leaving voice messages saying he missed me and that he wanted to get married. I have no clue how he got my number, and he also made fake accounts attempting to follow me on social media. The cops say that he would actually have to do something to me to have them monitor my house or take him to a mental hospital. This restraining order is only a piece of paper, and I'm losing sleep. A few years ago, my brother-in-law bought another apartment complex in Florida. He owns a few apartment complexes in West Palm Beach and Miami. So when he told me he bought another one and wanted me to manage it, I figured, why the hell not? I had just graduated college with my degree and planned to go out and get a master's, so I figured I could manage his place and do graduate school. When he booked my flight to Orlando, I was stoked. Hell yes, I love Disney and I dreamed about buying a year pass and checking out all the neat parks. Then when I got there, we drove out to Orlando and I had a bad feeling. He bought the apartment in a town called Leesburg. It's only about an hour from Orlando. It's if a biker town and a retirement community had a baby. I was a little disappointed that I was an hour from Orlando, with its nightlife and clubs and whatnot. I made it work though and soon started to settle into life managing the small apartment complex. I had my own one-bedroom apartment in the corner, and then there were 10 other tenants. Most were older folks, snowbirds and retirees that spent their days golfing and swimming in the pool we had. There were 2 military families, one with small kids, and then there was Andy. Andy was an enormous man. I'm a pretty big guy, 6 foot and around 250 pounds, and he was at least 6'6" and 400 plus pounds. He walked with a cane and had long black hair which he put into a ponytail. He worked from home, or so he said, but rumour was that he was on disability after a horrific work accident. I didn't really care though. He paid his rent on time and he was quiet and kept to himself. I was only in his place once when his AC cut out, and to my surprise, found out that he was pretty neat. No food containers or pizza boxes or beer cans, etc. I expected a big guy like him to have things laid out. Things in our complex were pretty good for the next year, until one night in November. It was raining like it always does in Florida, and it was about midnight when someone rang my doorbell. I looked out and saw one of my tenants, Joseph. Joe was one of my retirees who retired to Florida to, in his words, play golf and drink beer. Normally he was all smiles and jokes, but that night his face was pale and he looked frightened. "I hate to bother you, Sam, but something isn't right with Andy," he said. I put my jacket on and followed him to his apartment, since Andy was his neighbour. He put his finger to his lip and motioned for me to listen. I put my ear up to the door and heard Andy fighting with someone. It sounded like whoever he was fighting with was also throwing things. I was taken aback, as he never had a guest over since the year I'd known him and that he'd lived there. So I knocked, and I heard him stomp over to the door and open it. Normally, he was very well dressed, put together, and like I said, he wasn't a messy guy, but he answered it in a t-shirt that had grease stains. His hair was limp and greasy, and he reeked of BO. I peered behind him and saw that his place was a disaster. I asked him if everything was okay. He was irritated and told me that it was and pretty much shut the door in my face. I sent Joe back to his place and told him to let me know if he heard anything else, and went to bed. The next morning, I decided to pay Andy a visit to see if he was okay, and I went to his place and knocked. No answer. So I decided I would try again later. But I got busy doing other things and then forgot all about it. So December rolls around, and I am in starting to get the monthly rent checks. But there's none from Andy. That got me a bit worried as he was always on time with his checks. So I knocked on his door. Nothing. I knocked again and I heard the guy grunting and moaning. Now, I should have called the police first, but I didn't. I opened the door with my keyring and was hit with the foulest smell ever. It smelled like shit, piss, vomit and BO rolled into one nasty smell. The walls were streaked with what I could assume was shit, and the place was trashed. I started to call Andy whilst dialing 911, and I heard the moaning from the back room. What I saw that day, I can never unsee. I sometimes still get flashbacks. Andy was naked and laying on the floor of his room on some dirty clothes. He was covered in his own shit and piss, and there was piles of vomit on the carpet. But what was worse is that he was covered in bites. Human bites all over his arms and legs, and they were starting to smell with infection. He was also bleeding from his rectum, and I wondered who attacked him. Was it the woman we heard him fighting with? I didn't get my answer until a few days later. He had to be rushed to the hospital and was fighting for his life in the ICU. The doctors spoke to his sister, who turned out to be his medical guardian. And things slowly came into place. Turns out Andy did that to himself. He suffered from multiple mental disorders. He stopped taking his meds the month before November. There was no other person that night. He was arguing with himself. Those bites, he infected himself. The bleeding from his rectum was from inserting a foreign object in there and doing so much damage it ruptured his internal organs. He ended up pulling through and went back home to live with his sister. I had the task of cleaning the apartment, and what I found whilst cleaning pretty much freaks me out, the same as finding him. He had a shoebox full of cutouts from magazines, old family photos, and even photos he obviously took of the residents of the apartments, including myself. All of the eyes were burnt out with cigarettes, and on some of them, X's were put over the mouths. I'm not sure if that was part of his mental decline, or if he was always that creepy and I just never noticed it. All I can hope for you, Andy, is that you got the help you needed and are feeling better. When my aunt told me this story, it was so casual, as though it was no big deal to her. But I didn't sleep well that night, or for a few nights for that matter, after hearing it, and I swear my mind wasn't helping either, because it kept on creating noises and images that weren't even there. So here's the story. My aunt and uncle were driving down a long and lonely road late one night. They were travelling and decided to use a less crowded road because they needed to get to their destination quickly. This road was long, with nothing but dense forest on both sides of it. Not even a single light or car is available on that road, so you can guess that ghosts or spirits like to lurk around, since there's no one there at night. As they were driving along this road, my uncle saw something in the distance. At first glance, it looked like a person crossing the road, so he slowed down. When they were driving closer and closer, the figure started taking a clearer and more defined shape. Horrified at what he was seeing, he came to an immediate stop. There, right in front of them, was a floating head. The head had long black hair flowing in the air, and from the head attached its spine and organs, but it had no limbs or torso. It was making a jingly sound, like a glass clinking. It floats across the road without taking any notice of my aunt and uncle's presence. Shivers ran all over their body, and they felt the cold breeze that ran to their very core. They were seeing a ghost called a Hantu Balong. My aunt was brave enough to even look at the spirit as it passed, staring at it and trying to find the rest of its body, but saw none. When the head disappeared into the forest, they immediately sped up the car to get the hell out of there. I wasn't sure if they saw anything else that night, but that was enough to scare the shit out of me. It didn't help that I had to stay alone that night either, and I swear my mind likes to psych me out too, by creating that jingly noise that isn't even there. So thanks, Auntie, for giving me all of those sleepless nights after telling me that story. Though it makes me wonder, if such a thing can be seen, who's to say they aren't real? A trick of the mind? A hallucination? It's possible. But what if they weren't either? And how come they both saw it at the same time? I came home late one night when I was 17, and the rest of my family was already in bed. I go to my room and just do typical stuff before bed. Work on my homework, speak to my friends on the phone, and listen to music. Finally, I go to bed a couple of hours later and nod off. I'm awoken by some rustling underneath my bed, but assume it's just my cat and roll over again to go back to sleep. A short while after, I'm awoken again. I lay there perfectly still and quiet and listened to the noise. This was when I realized that the noise was coming from an animal much larger than any damn cat. Since I lived near the woods, my imagination started running wild. Was it a rabid raccoon? A sinister skunk? A crazed coyote? It took me about 5 minutes to work up the courage to peek under the bed and try and figure out what I was dealing with. I slowly rolled over and glanced down through the small gap between my mattress and my bed frame and saw the scariest thing I've ever seen. It was a hair-covered arm of a man. My heart started racing, and I felt like either vomiting or pooping my pants. I knew I needed to run, but all I kept thinking of was that this diabolical murderer/rapist was going to slash my Achilles tendon as soon as I stood up, and my ankles were within reach. I finally gathered the courage to leap from the bed and make a dash towards the door. This was when I realized that it was actually possible to be so terrified that no noise came out of you when you scream. I made it to the door and was running from the stairs up to my parents' room when I was grabbed from behind and a hand clamped over my mouth. Long story short, once the guy started whispering for me to be quiet, I realized who it was. It was a guy I'd been on a few dates with. He was trying to apologize for scaring me and said that he didn't mean to and that he just wanted to see me when I was alone. Hysterical me started crying and told him to get out of my house, and he had the nerve to ask me for a ride home. A couple of lessons were learned. My parents sleep like the dead and are not even woken up when their child is near murdered in the basement, and sneaking into a girl's house and hiding under a girl's bed is not an acceptable way to learn more about her. Also, I may be just too nice and understanding. I think I probably should have called the cops on this guy, but instead, I told him just to leave me alone and not talk to me anymore because my parents told me that he seemed like a nice boy who just made a bad judgment call. However, this incident still haunts me years later. It seemed really scary to me. I attend an extremely old college in Ireland. It was built in the 1700s as a seminary for Catholic priests during the collapse of the penal laws. It's now a generally secular institution, although it still has strong Catholic ties. I am a believer in God from a Catholic family, but I wouldn't call myself Catholic. The college accepts all denominations, nationalities, and sexual orientations, so it's generally a great community-driven place. I am a history student, and during a recent class, we were told that our college was the site of a massacre of Irish rebels during the 1798 rebellion at the hands of the British. Some died on the front steps and others inside. I need to explain that I am an idiot, and I wanted to see if I could communicate with the spirits, which is both insensitive and plain dumb. But anyway, I did it and experienced the worst fright of my life. The way the college is laid out, when you enter, the dining rooms, library, and majority of lecture halls, student union buildings, and mediation areas are all located either straight ahead or to the right. The place is very Hogwartsian, and there are numerous stone steps leading everywhere. There's many stories to this building. It's very large, but the college population inclusive of staff and students, as well as daily visitors, is quite small. This means that after 5 o'clock, it's often deserted save a few people in the library. The main entrance to the corridor leading to the old entrance hall is where the current chaplain and college president lives. In this hall is a gigantic old portrait that spans nearly the entire wall, and a set of stone steps leading up several floors. I am currently minoring in history and majoring in English, and I've always been attracted to the ghostly. And after hearing about the rebellion in 1798, I decided to contact a few ghosts myself with this shitty app called Ghostbox E1 Spirit EVP. Only a few lecture halls located at the stone steps are generally not in use, but they are available for booking and are often left open. It was about 6 o'clock in the evening. I sat at one of the lecture desks overlooking the front lawn of the college, in a lecture hall which I gauged to be roughly around the steps of the old entrance of where the people were killed. I tried for 4 or 5 minutes just asking the app different questions, and nothing was coming through. It was raining, and the room was kind of dark, and I was creeped out a bit. But I wanted to have something to tell people. I was asking the usual, "Is anyone here?" etc., and eventually I got a very faint voice saying something. I listened again, and it said something along the lines of "Imithe dia" 3 or 4 times, and for anyone who doesn't speak Irish, "Imithe dia" means God is gone. I was creeped out. You have to remember that the priests would have been speaking Irish a lot at the time, but I hardly imagined them saying God is gone. I was packing up my bag out of fear when the door I had just come through opened by itself and slammed shut. I froze. I couldn't move, and my blood honestly felt like ice. All I could hear was the pitter-patter of rain in the distance. I stood beside the desk for a minute before I started leaving again. I made it through the door and out onto the landing and started walking down the stone steps. I was shaking with fear, mind and my vision all gone weirdly black with fright. When I was on the next landing down, ready to go onto the next stone steps, the door I had come through started violently banging over and over. There was a man screaming very, very loudly. The words were incoherent, but let me tell you, the scream was blood-curdling. My blood subsequently went cold, and I don't know exactly how to describe it, but the door, a massively heavy door, continued to slam until I reached the main entrance. I could hear it through the halls, and I was bawling crying at this point, and shaking so bad I could hardly walk. I ran out the doors and onto the street, and I went and bought a Pepsi and sat down until my bus arrived. I haven't been able to sleep ever since, not properly anyway. This was a week or 2 ago, towards the end of the college year, and the exams were over, so at least I didn't have those to worry about. I'm not really sure what I experienced. In truth, it has left me utterly terrified. I'm rueful that I ever tried getting involved with spirits in the first place. I hope I didn't disturb anything, and hope that we can both mutually be left in peace. My cousin was alone in the kitchen, washing the glasses after the guests had left. It was around 8 or 9 p.m. at the time. While she was washing, she heard some odd noises coming from outside. They sounded like a shriek. Since her family lives in a house by the mountains, with nothing but forests covering every inch of it, she shrugged it off as the sound of animals in the forest. But then she heard it again, a shriek, almost like a laughter, right before the sound of a tree rustling. Not long after, there was the sound of a firecracker exploding a couple of times. Just as soon as she heard the firecracker, she heard the sound of another awful shriek, followed by trees rustling again. She thought that it could be kids playing outside, so she just ignored it. A few minutes passed, and there was a knock on the door. The neighbors came over and told them to pray for protection that night. When they asked about it, they said that they saw a female ghost known as a Pontiac. The neighbors said they heard noises coming from the coconut trees in their compound, and when they went to check it out, they saw the ghost clinging onto the tree, prying open a coconut. They scared it away using firecrackers, and it jumped down into the forest. My cousin didn't sleep well that night. She refused to sleep alone in her room, and slept with her sister for a few nights after that. Now, you may not know what a Pontianak is. They are basically a Southeast Asian version of vampires, only that this one doesn't suck blood, change into a bat, or sleep during the day. Instead, they would sometimes take the form of beautiful young women, and would always carry a single flower that would have a powerful and good smell. The reason why is because they themselves smelt like rotten meat. Their true forms are long black tangly hair with a large white cloth that drags on the ground as they walk. They are also extremely pale with red blood eyes and are said to laugh in a very high-pitched tone. It is said that the Pontianaks are spirits of pregnant women who died before they were able to give birth, which is why there are stories here of women who are about to give birth, seeing them lurk around, seeing them just a few days before going into labor. So, if you're going to give birth, be careful if you see a beautiful woman in old traditional clothing with a single flower in their hair. You may never know what they'll do to your baby. For what it's worth, I stayed the night with a friend during high school. Me, him, and another dude were drinking some beers in this house, and the house was getting ready to be demolished. The only items left in the house were OJ's whole bedroom. He grew up in the house and hated to leave, and wanted to make it to the last second. So we're all here drinking and bullshitting in his room. The TV was on, but we weren't paying it much attention. Anywho, we all decided to go to the living room and put a couple of sledgehammers through the walls for shits and giggles. We all walked out of the room, and the TV immediately turned off. I noticed it immediately and it spooked me, so I asked OJ about it. And he, without missing a beat, goes, "Oh yeah, that's just George." I look at him deadpan as hell. He didn't even try to explain. I asked him who in the ever-loving hell was George. Naturally, George is the man who built the original house and was driving his kids in his dump truck, and had the back end raised in such a fashion that they could stand really high in it. Well, long story short, they got decapitated on a railroad overpass, not but 200 yards from the house down the country road. So George hung himself in the attic. And not only did he hang himself, but the attic is only about 5 feet in height, so that dude put a rope around his neck and lifted his feet high enough, yada yada yada, you get the point. So he went on about the other shit that George and the kids would do around the house. Stuff out of place, doors and windows opening, closing, the usual weird ghostly shit, right? Well, I didn't believe a lick of this paranormal bullshit, even with the TV going off in front of me. But old OJ looked at his clock, and it was around 3:45 in the morning. He looked at me and said, "At 4:04 exactly, you'll start to hear intermittent tapping noises, always in twos. Tap tap, pause, 5 seconds, tap tap." Yeah, whatever, OJ. Anyway, when the clocks hit 4:04, tap tap, tap tap. Me and OJ and Nate were all in the same room. I could see their hands and feet, anything that could be used to make this tapping noises, and it very clearly wasn't them. I turned white. I mean, I was turning whiter than a ghost when I realized that it just might actually exist. And OJ just looks at me very nonchalantly and goes, "Told ya." The most bizarre thing about it though, you couldn't pinpoint the noise. It was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The sound wasn't directional. It was like it was off in the distance, but you couldn't move closer or further away from it. It was just there. Tap tap. Tap tap. Needless to say, I refused putting a hole in any of those walls with a sledgehammer. I also did not sleep, and I also got very, very, very drunk after that happened. Still don't know what to think, to be honest, but that's some serious shit, I tell you. I'd just like to add, I went into the attic where George hung himself. I like to think myself as a very stable person when it comes to dark, cold, confined spaces. I don't get phobias or nervous really, but to this day, I have never experienced such a dark, cold feeling down to my bones. You could feel the energy in the room. It felt as though it was sucking the life out of you. It took me 10 seconds before I came sprinting down the stairs in sheer terror, and decided not to go back up there for the rest of the night. Here's something else that happened. My friend Lighty and I would go to his parents' farm property all the time with a gator, and just explore the 140-acre property pretty regularly a few summers back. As we would come and go, we'd chat with the few farmers that sharecropped the land. That was about 4 or 5, and we'd bullshit with stories and whatnot. Now these guys certainly have a sense of humour, but weren't joking one bit when they were telling us about the old lady. So Lighty's grandparents had purchased the land from the bank after an older lady had passed away whilst living in the tiny 1920s Depression-style shack on the property. 1 room, 4 windows, and it was falling apart. Scary as shit. The typical old farmhouse, right? Well, we noticed a trend in the farmers' stories, or at least one in particular. They all spoke of seeing a woman, an old woman, staring at them through the windows at times. Now, I live my life as the devil's advocate. Each farmer I ask the same question to. Which window? My thought is that they're all bullshitting. They're named separate windows, right? Makes sense. Nope. Each had the same response. All of them. I was baffled. I should note that all of these farmers also don't know each other, all from different local neighbouring towns, but still were not in contact with each other. No corroboration. No slick, clever, let's try and scare the shit out of these kids type of scenario. No possibility of it being a lamp in the damn window. Can't be that easy. Still never stopped us from going out onto the damn property. I guess Sue never minded either. That's what we named her. Sue, the window ghost. When Lighty and I were driving on that same property, 2 blue orbs rose out from a water tank in a small creek, and just floated down the creek. It was about the size of a baseball. Apparently Lighty's grandfather told stories of the same 2 blue orbs, as well as multiple people in that county. It was like some urban legend we'd not heard of until we were told by Lighty's father, who eventually filled us in. It apparently happens all over the place, but only in this county, and in this creek. So bizarre. I lost my mind watching those orbs float into the air, travelling at the same speed as the water. I'll never forget it, and we never said another word during the incident. This guy I know was alerted that a couple of houses were being broken into in his area, and he decided to buy a gun, in case things were to escalate. He recently had a daughter and wanted to ensure his safety and theirs. A couple of weeks go by, and he's getting Chinese food on a Friday night, and as soon as he leaves, he sees this car tailing him. He decides it's nothing. Florida drivers are terrible, and keeps it moving. After multiple turns, he notices that the car was following him. Eventually this escalates to the car honking and flashing their lights, and at this point he is speeding, freaking out and worried. He gets to the house safely and runs inside with his baby and wife. He tells them to hide in the bathroom as he gets the gun out from under the bed. As he's locked the front door, he hears someone walking on the lawn slowly. The person knocks on the door, so he screams, "I have a gun and I've called the police, get off my property." A couple of moments go by, and he hears this frightened voice say, "Sir, you forgot your fried rice." Hey guys, it's Mort here, and thank you so much for listening. Wishing you all a very lovely Saturday night. I just wanted to apologize again for the glitch that happened the other day, and explain it a little. So what happened is that the video 2 days ago didn't publish properly. Next to no one got notified about it, and it appeared without a thumbnail, and wasn't visible on the video section of my channel. Only if you searched for it, which was extremely odd, did it appear. Of course, this meant that very few of you got to see it. So I ended up having to delete it as YouTube didn't help me fix the issue, and then I had to re-upload it. You know, when I tried contacting YouTube regarding the issue, they sent me this generic message saying that if I wanted my subscribers to see my videos, they had to click the little bell icon. I was just really disappointed that no one actually listened to what I had to say, or bothered investigating the issue further. But anyway, that was yesterday's video, and I just hope we don't have a repeat of that in future. But just in case we do, I'd really appreciate it if you could just hit the little bell thing, and that means you should be notified every time. Remember that most of the official Mortis Media merchandise will be disappearing in 4 days' time. So get in there quickly if there's something you've been wanting for a while. If you'd like me to read your story on my channel, feel free to send it to my email or share it to my Reddit, which is of course in the description. Please make sure to include as much punctuation and descriptive language as possible, as it maximizes the chances of it being read. And don't forget to check out my Instagram and Twitter. But anyway, for now guys, I'm going to sign off. Stay awesome, and I'll see you in the next one.